was always like a second Christmas for me. Not only did I get to express my inner fantasies through costume, it just so happens to be my birthday. This would all change on October 29th of 2016. This year was a big one. I was turning 21. That meant that I could celebrate on 6th Street. If you don't know, 6th Street in Austin is the heart of the city's nightlife. Music venues and bars, 6th Street has it all. Halloween on 6th is an experience everyone should have at least once in their lives. I'd always heard the crazy stories, and finally, I get to tell some of my own, and I couldn't wait. Since the holiday fell on a Monday, the festivities would be taking place the Saturday before. It was usually the night with the most people. All the amazing costumes may be the best part of Halloween, and the costumes on 6th are some of the most inventive and interesting I'd ever seen. All 5 of us girls packed into a cab and took the 3-mile ride downtown. It was almost 11 p.m. People were just beginning to arrive, and I was eager to have my first legal drink. I don't want to name any businesses for legal reasons, and suffice to say, we spent the next 4 hours hopping from club to club and bar to bar until last call at 2. Much of it was a blur. I woke up on my bathroom floor with a toilet full of barf. It was an amazing night, and I'll never forget it, but not for the reasons I'd like. That next afternoon, I was nursing a major hangover when I got a call from one of my friend's mothers. Terry, I changed her name for privacy, had not made it home. Her mother hadn't received any calls or texts from her in over 24 hours. This was very strange. Terry and her mom were very close, and there was no way she wouldn't let her know if she was staying elsewhere. And the two of us spent the rest of the day and late into the night trying to locate Terry, but no one knew anything. The next day, we contacted the police, and they took over from there. Surveillance videos would be screened over and over. A bunch of men, her boyfriend among them, were questioned, but nothing ever came of it, and the case soon hit a dead end. Terry's disappearance would completely change how myself and my friends led our lives. To this day, I will not go anywhere alone, and I refuse to get drunk in public. I've carried a firearm since 2017. I know I'm not strong enough to fight off multiple men. In the years since, a lot of things have changed, but when it comes to my safety, I remain just as vigilant. Terry's case had stalled by my next birthday, but I would receive a belated gift just a couple of months later. It was the middle of a normal workday when I got a phone call from another friend of mine. She said that she had got a phone call from Terry's mom. My heart sank. I assumed Terry's body had been discovered. But to my joy, it turned out that she had been found, alive. Police in Kansas City had found a young woman hiding in an alley with a handcuff around her wrist. According to her, she had been kidnapped from Austin, Texas, and held several places until reaching Kansas City. She'd been kept there since about late spring or early summer. Her captors had assaulted her countless times. She feared that she would be killed when they grew tired of her, so she did her best to gain their confidence until she could escape. The chance came, and she took it. The cops raided the house she'd been kept in and arrested 3 men. I was over the moon. In my mind, Terry's nightmare was over. She could come back home and pick up where she'd left off. I'll admit how naive that actually sounds, but I was a young and sheltered girl. How could I have known? When I did see Terry again, everything had changed. Talking about day-to-day things seemed so childish in light of what she'd gone through. Her beautiful smile was gone. Any happiness had been beaten out of her, and we all felt helpless, but not as helpless as her. She did make an effort to make a new life. She returned to school and began dating again, and none of these efforts came to much. Once the trial of the 3 men began, she was forced to relive the nightmare. They were convicted, and she tried again only to have the men with a new trial on appeal. It looked as if though she'd be forced to relive her captivity repeatedly until she died. To her credit, she didn't let her misfortune break her. The 3 men were convicted again and put away once and for all. After all the hurdles she was forced to jump, she would finally win out. And just as the lockdowns were set to start, her and her boyfriend of 2 years were married. They recently had twins, and the birth was the first time I'd seen Terry smile in a very long time. Hopefully, with a lot of support from her family and friends, she'll be able to build some semblance of a normal life. This happened on July 29th, 2022. That was just a few weeks ago now. I turned 25 the day before. All the restrictions had ruined my previous 2 birthdays, and I was more than ready to make up for lost time. My boy Murph would be joining me for the celebrations. We met the first day of kindergarten and had been best buds ever since. We'd been trapped inside for too long, and this night was our excuse to party like we were 21 again. Our 2 goals were to drink excess and hook up with some hot chicks, obviously. We very nearly achieved both, but a crazy incident derailed any hopes that we had for reaching the latter of the 2. The festivities kicked off at about 5 p.m. It was probably too early in retrospect. I was so drunk by 10, I had thrown up and taken a bit of a break. The night was far from over, though. After we stopped for a big dinner and a couple of cups of coffee at IHOP, we were back on the prowl. A friend of ours tends bar at this hole-in-a-wall downtown. We got a drink for free for the rest of the evening, and drink we did. And we didn't just drink, though. Remember, our second goal was to hook up, and the bar was packed full of potential. A table with 2 girls caught my eye, and I grabbed Murph for the approach. We got the okay to sit down, and things progressed nicely from there. By last call, we were all sufficiently loaded. I can't remember who made the suggestion, but an Uber was called and we all piled in. The girls shared a small house a few miles away, and this was our destination. Murph and his girl were all over each other. The girl I was with was considerably less affectionate. I'll admit, I was jealous. My girl seemed kind of nervous, and that can sometimes be a bad sign. The ride was only a few minutes. Our driver pulled onto this long gravel driveway. The house sat about 50 yards at the end. We reached the house and the girls got out first. The doors were still open. I was fumbling around for my phone when I heard a male voice yelling, and I looked up to see 2 guys. They must have been hiding and waiting for us to arrive, and from what I could make out, one of the guys, the one with the golf club, was my girl's boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. He was calling her all sorts of terrible names, and the second guy just stood back and watched as all this occurred. Murph and I stayed in the car and waited to see what would happen. Both girls began yelling at this boyfriend, and he wasn't having it. He pushed one into the other, and they both fell to the ground, and things were starting to get real. I wanted to leave, and my decision was made final when the boyfriend began yelling to Murph and I to get out of the car. He started calling us all types of names, and I guess he thought this would make us mad, but it did the opposite, in fact. I looked over at Murph and said, "Screw this, man. Let's get out of here." He nodded and we slammed our door shut. I leaned forward and told the driver to go. He didn't need me to ask twice. He slammed the car in reverse and we spit gravel everywhere. The boyfriend began chasing us and caught up when the driver stopped to turn. He shifted quickly and we were away, but not before the boyfriend managed to get one hit on the rear fender. The driver didn't appear to care, and we were all just happy to get out unscathed. It may be hard to believe, but I was stone cold sober after that. It was like a switch had been flipped. When we arrived back at our place, we all got out to examine the damage. It wasn't major, but bad enough to see in the dark. The Uber driver told me not to worry because he had insurance, but I felt bad all the same and just gave him an extra $100 in cash. He'd earned that just for saving our butts. He thanked me and took off. Had I been thinking, I would have gotten his name so I could hire him if I needed him in the future, but I was a little distracted. And since then, Murph and I have laid low. I'd really like to go out again, but the events of that night have got me shook. Some of you may attack me for not standing up for the girls, but I made it a rule not to get involved in fights between a man and a woman, especially between partners. A lot of men have found themselves 6 feet under because they stuck their nose in where it didn't belong, and I refuse to be one of them. Maybe after another month passes, Murph and I will go see our friend at the bar. If the girl I was with that night happens to see this post, I want you to know. Murph and I had a good time with you and your friend. and I hope everything worked out with your boyfriend, but for all of our sakes, we should probably never meet again. When I joined Reddit a few years ago, I wasn't sure how I'd be treated. I was almost 50 and had no idea what younger people were into. As I suspected, I was treated with suspicion and disrespect in the beginning. In most Redditors' eyes, I was nothing more than a clueless boomer. Part of that may have been correct. I'd been busy raising a daughter and didn't have time to keep up with all the newest music and lingo. And now, I'm divorced and my girl is married. I finally have the time. And despite a rocky first few months, the negative comments began to give way to honest curiosity. My age gave me the advantage. My life experience could help those in search of certain answers. I started frequenting forums where what I knew was welcomed. Since then, I made a lot of friends on here, and many are even older than me. I noticed there's a lot of objects out there. While no longer in common use, most people know what they are. The 8-track cassette comes to mind, and you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody under 40 who ever actually used one. Yet, there is another group of objects that were once very popular and are now almost completely unknown to the younger generations. One example would be lawn darts or yard darts. They were just what they sound like, big darts that you would toss into the air and try to land in a big ring. As you can imagine, they were super dangerous. After a bunch of kids got skewered by them, they were pulled off the market. Another of these things just so happened to play a very big part in my life. I'll bring you back to 1984, the year that I turned 11 and life was great for a kid. G.I. Joe was on TV, Van Halen was the coolest band around, and I was spending the summer with my grandparents on their farm. My birthday was July 14th. That morning, my parents showed up with a present for me. In the back of my dad's truck sat a brand new Honda 3-wheel ATV. I was peeing my pants with glee, and Dad rolled it out and took the first drive around the farm. He came close to flipping it once or twice, but he figured that I'd be able to handle it since I was smaller. When my turn came, I took things slow. In no time, I had everything down and was tearing around the back pasture like a pro. The next day, I explored and discovered everything for miles in every direction. That 3-wheeler became a part of my body, and there was nothing I couldn't do and nowhere I couldn't go. That weekend, my family had a big post-church lunch. My parents, aunts, uncles, and a few cousins all showed up. After the meal, the adults went off to do adult stuff, and I was left with my 2 cousins. The older of the 2 was 12 and his sister was 9. I didn't know either one of them very well, but I hated the sister the second I met her. She thought she knew everything and was so much more grown up than us. And when they found out that I had the 3-wheeler, the girl demanded that I let her ride it. I reluctantly agreed. I showed her how to work everything and warned her to be careful. She arrogantly proclaimed that she didn't need anyone's help. She gunned it and took off faster than I would have ever dared. Not even a minute went by before she crashed. All we could see was the 3-wheeler flipped over on top of her, and we waited for her to get up, but she didn't move. And I still remember when my male cousin screamed, "You killed my sister." He started wailing and crying for his parents, and I was terrified that she had broken my 3-wheeler, and I started crying myself. The adults ran out to see what was wrong. My male cousin pointed at the 3-wheeler and described what had happened, and it all hit the fan after that. My aunt and uncle ran over to the wreck and pulled the ATV off. My uncle ran back up to the house and called 911. The ambulance showed up and took her away. I didn't consider that she could be severely injured. In my mind, she was alive and that was good enough. Dad rolled the 3-wheeler into the barn and we went inside for the night. The next morning, we heard that she had broken her neck and was paralyzed, but the doctors expected her to regain full mobility. In my mind, she got what she asked for. I headed out to the barn, but my grandpa stopped me. My dad told him that the Honda was damaged, that I wouldn't be able to ride it until it was fixed, and I was not happy to hear this. My life had become permanently intertwined with that Honda. I felt lost and unsure of what to do, but I had no choice but to accept this and hope that it would be fixed quickly. A few days went by until a guy showed up in a pickup and took the three-wheeler away. I ran inside to ask Grandpa how long it would take to fix, and he sat me down and told me that my parents sold it because they thought it was too dangerous. I flipped out and threw the kind of fit that only someone my age could. This was on par with shooting my dog, or so I thought. I cried and screamed myself hoarse. You get the idea. This was all the fault of my stupid cousin, and I would never forgive her. I called my parents and tried my hardest to get them to change their mind, but it had already been done. No amount of crying and complaining was going to change that. Eventually, I did stop thinking about it and focused on other stuff. I wouldn't think about it again until 1988 when I heard that they were banned for being too dangerous, and this just made my parents more confident that they made the right choice. All it did for me was to reopen a sore that I thought had long healed, and I suppose it's still a sore spot if I'm writing about it 38 years later. Just so you won't go away thinking that I'm too petty, I did forgive my cousin. She suffered more than enough for her mistake. Since the accident, she had 3 surgeries and will probably have at least 1 more before she dies. God knows how much pain she deals with on a daily basis. That's about it for me. I hope my tale provided you Gen Y and Z Redditors with a little peek at what life was like for us in the 80s. Although we weren't lucky enough to have all the cool modern things like cell phones and the internet, there were still plenty of awesome inventions around to keep us entertained. If you think we had some crazy stuff when I was young, I suggest you look into the insane things that my parents' generation were allowed to play with. Can you believe the boomers had chemistry sets with several kinds of uranium in them? Maybe that's why they ended up as insane as they are. We'll probably never get the answer on that one. And I hope you all enjoyed my story. If anyone has any questions, you know where to find me. Thank you, good luck, and stay away from those yard darts. I went to the movies with a friend of mine back in 2016. He had turned 14 earlier in the week, and we planned to see a movie and I would spend the night after. His parents dropped us off at the mall at around 5 p.m. It was just the 2 of us. Chris was a quiet, shy guy and didn't have many friends. We ate a big meal at Chick-fil-A and wandered around until the movie was about to start. He bought a used game at GameStop with some of his birthday money. There were a few other things, but nothing I can recall after this long. When 7 got close, we headed to the movies. Captain America: Civil War had just come out, so we picked that. After the movie was over, we hung around outside the theater. The mall had already closed. It was quiet and not many people were around. He was supposed to call his parents when the movie ended, but he wanted to wait a while. He didn't get out on his own very often and was reluctant for the night to end. About 10:30, we were sitting on a big concrete planter box talking when we heard some voices behind us. We turned around to see 2 older kids from school. They were bullies that we both had problems with in the past. It seems the older of the pair, who was 16, worked in the mall somewhere. I suggested that we avoided looking at them so they wouldn't recognize us, but this didn't work. Even in the dark, they knew who we were. The older kid asked what we were doing, and I said that we were waiting for our ride. Chris didn't say anything, and this is when the name-calling started. I told him that we didn't want any trouble, and this just seemed to make things worse. I leaned over and whispered to Chris to call his mom. Meanwhile, the boys got more and more aggressive. The younger kid started poking me in the chest with his finger and called me the P word over and over, and I couldn't take it anymore. If they wanted to fight, I'd give them one. I jumped up and rushed at the younger guy. We began fighting on the ground. The older boy slapped the phone out of Chris's hand and sucker punched him. I eventually got the better of the boy, and he begged me to stop hitting him. I noticed Chris was now on the ground getting kicked. I was still too scared to go after the older boy. His size was that intimidating, and I knew I had to get some help. The only place still open was the movies, so that's where I ran to. I had to go all the way around the back of the mall to reach the theater. I pulled on the doors, but they were locked. The people in the concession stand pointed to a side door. I ran around to the one and asked the girl in the box office to help, and she called the security guard and I told him what was happening, and we both ran back to the front of the mall where the fight was taking place. When I came around the corner, The first thing I saw was the 16-year-old stomping on Chris's head while the younger boy kicked him in the stomach. The security guard yelled out to them to stop. When they saw him, they ran off to a nearby car and sped away. I thought Chris was dead at first. Blood was coming out of his nose and ears, but I could see him breathing. The guard called 911 and an ambulance arrived a few minutes later. I stayed behind to speak to the police. I also called Chris's parents to let them know what had happened. They were freaked, as you would expect. I talked to the police and then rode with them to the hospital. Chris's parents were already there when we arrived, and what I encountered made an already scary situation into a terrifying nightmare. Chris's head was now swollen up like a watermelon and black and blue with bruising. No one had expected him to live out the night, and he was rushed off to surgery. His condition remained urgent for over a week, and during this time, the boys involved were arrested and given bail. Chris survived despite all expectations, and his condition would gradually improve. More than 2 months later, he finally was deemed well enough to go home. He wasn't totally healed yet, but his age made the process a little quicker. All this time, while Chris fought to regain a small shred of normality to his life, the two a-holes who did that to him were still going to school and playing football like nothing happened. Most of the kids at school played along. The teachers only seemed to care about winning football games, and I got so fed up I moved to a homeschool program until I turned 16, and at 16 I got my GED. To this day, I wouldn't spit on a single person from that school if they were on fire. I wish them all a long and painful death, and I'm sorry, but that's just how I feel. Chris was completing his rehab when the trial came around. The district attorney decided to prosecute the older boy as an adult, and he was initially charged with attempted murder, but that was quickly dropped down to a Class A misdemeanor assault. And that's ridiculous considering the extent of damage he'd inflicted on Chris. The younger of the two agreed to testify against the older boy and got off scot-free. Nonetheless, I was assured the 16-year-old would be given at least a year in prison, but when it came down to it, the judge let him off with a fine and 5 years of probation. His lawyer tried to assert that Chris used a racial slur towards his client, an idea completely impossible if you knew my friend Chris. The DA thinks this may have played a part in the sentencing, and the result was a disgusting miscarriage of justice, in my opinion. Everyone was furious, especially me and Chris's dad. There was a very real fear that he may go after the young man, and he talked about killing him more than once, but he was eventually convinced that it would do more damage to his family. And that said, he's still very angry about how things went. As I write this, I'm attending a local community college and hope to transfer to university in the next year or so. Chris, on the other hand, is unemployed and still living with his parents. I'd like to blame the attack, but Chris was never an outgoing guy. He struggles with some small memory issues, but nothing too bad. Although his life will never be the same, I've never heard him complain. I don't care how long he lives, as long as he's happy, and if he chooses to spend the rest of his life living with his folks, I'll support his decision. He's earned the right to decide. He doesn't talk about what happened, and I don't bring it up. It seems that he's been able to move on. As for me, I'm not quite as forgiving. I'll never be able to forget what those monsters did to my friend. I suggest they keep their noses clean. A lot of people are watching and waiting for one, or both of them, to make a small mistake, and this is when they'll strike, and no amount of money or popularity will be able to save them this time. It should have been a happy night for all of us, but it ended in tragedy. It wasn't just my 21st birthday, but Mark's was the next day. And I met Mark at a church camp at 10, and we've been friends ever since. There wasn't much to do in our town. We lived in a dry county, a common thing in smaller sections of the Bible Belt. Fortunately, the next county over was wet. We could buy our booze and bring it back home, and none of us had our own places, so we reserved a few rooms in a rundown motel out in the middle of nowhere. Kids have been doing this for as long as I was alive, and no one seemed to care. The owners were happy to get the business, and as long as nothing got damaged, they wouldn't call the sheriff. It was long tradition that I was looking forward to playing my part. Mark and I left his place at around 5 p.m. to make the 35-mile drive to the nearest liquor store. Everyone had written down what they wanted and given us their money. An extra $20 was put in by each person for Mark and me to get whatever we wanted. It was all loaded in the back of Mark's truck, and we headed to the motel to drop it off. The celebrations weren't scheduled to start until later that evening, but we couldn't resist opening a bottle and knocking back a couple of shots. An hour later, we returned home. Each of us had plans to go out to dinner with our families, and we did that, and after, met back at Mark's at about 10. From there, we took Mark's truck to the motel. A few of our friends had already showed up, and one guy was well on his way to passing out. Mark and I joined in, and over the next few hours, people came and went. We'd rented 3 rooms next to each other. Each one had its own little vibe going on. Our room was more middle of the road. We had a small Bluetooth speaker playing music, but not so loud people couldn't talk and joke around. The one next to ours was where the smokers hung out. The mood was more laid back and chill. The one on the end was for the rowdy folk. The motel owners had to tell them more than once to calm down. It took a threat of calling the sheriff before they dialed it back a little. Overall, it was the ideal 21st birthday. It was the closest to perfect I could ever imagine. But then someone suggested that we make another beer run. I'm sure I don't have to explain why this was a bad idea. A guy had just arrived and wanted some booze of his own. An understandable and admirable idea. We thought he was sober. He looked okay, but okay to a drunk kid is meaningless. What we didn't know was that he had taken a handful of oxys before arriving. One shot of liquor is a bad idea with pills, and he'd taken another right before we left. None of this was a big deal to us at the time. When the subject of a beer run first came up, I asked if I could come along. I was out of cigarettes and wanted some more, and Mark being Mark had to come along with me. There were 5 of us along for the ride, 4 of us in the bed of the truck. It was a nice summer night and the breeze felt good. The journey to the store went smoothly. We were coming back when the driver appears to have passed out or nodded off. We're not sure which. And he lost control of the truck, and it slammed into a massive tree, almost head-on. He was killed on impact. The girl in the passenger seat was saved by her seatbelt, but still experienced some internal injuries. As for those in the back, 2 of us, myself among them, were thrown around and broke a few bones, but otherwise went away undamaged. It was the other 2 who suffered the worst. The guy who was closest to the cab was paralyzed from the neck down. And then there's Mark, my best friend. He had been sitting on the wheel well hump at the time of the crash. It's not an uncommon thing. If you grew up in the South, you would probably do it more than once. And this positioned him higher in the bed. The force of the impact flung him from the bed of the truck into another one of the big trees alongside the road. And he probably died instantly. It was almost a month until I was alone and able to process the loss. Since the driver died, most of the older people were satisfied. There were a few do-gooders who wanted some new laws, but it all blew over pretty fast and they moved on to something else. Anytime I find myself back home, I make sure to visit Mark's grave and catch him up on things. I do as much as I'm able to keep his memory alive. This story is just the latest of my efforts. My firstborn son bears his name, and I carried around a lot of guilt for a while. It took a few talks with friends and a little counseling before I was able to let things go. I now realize that I bear no more responsibility than anyone else except the driver. Even in his case, he just happened to be the one driving. We were all just stupid kids. What happened on that road was a result of bad decision-making. We all paid a price for it, and some far more than others. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. I was 10 when this happened. To be more exact, it was my 10th birthday. All the younger kids in the neighborhood were invited to the party. My dad was going to grill a bunch of hot dogs and burgers. My mom bought one of those piñata things from Kroger's and filled it with a bunch of candy. We had only moved into the area the year prior. A lot of our neighbors were still strangers to us, and my parents wanted to change that, and this was their chance. Kids and parents started to show up at about 1. My mom made name tags for everyone. It was her way for all of us to get to know each other. It wasn't a bad idea, but at the time, the whole concept embarrassed me. Dad pulled out the grill as soon as the first group arrived. He was an old-school griller. Propane was an affront to our forefathers, and it was either charcoal or nothing. He had his own little routine that he went through. It made the whole process take a lot longer than it should have. As he did this, he knocked back Coors after Coors. In truth, he started drinking before lunch, and this was normal for him. He'd go through a case of beer in a weekend, and I suppose these days he'd be considered an alcoholic. The weird thing is, I never saw him drink during the week, and it never adversely affected our family's quality of life, except for this one time. It was an hour before he was satisfied with the coals. By then, we were all starving. A few kids were crying. The parents started pressuring my dad to hurry up, and rather than act calmly, he panicked and grabbed the lighter fluid. He got way too close to the grill and squirted a massive amount of fluid onto the coals. It went everywhere, and not only onto the grill, but his shirt and pants were soaked. The second the fuel hit the burning coals, a giant fireball blew everything around it back a foot or two. Everyone jumped back and turned away from the flames. When I turned back, my dad was laying stunned on the ground. The fluid on his clothes had caught fire, and he was so stunned and probably drunk that he didn't realize it. A couple of the other fathers ran over and smothered the flames with some tablecloths. Even more kids started crying now. Soon, they were begging to go home. Almost everyone left after that. My party had officially ended before it had even started. I'd wager that stupid piñata is still sitting in my parents' attic. I stood by in shock and disbelief, unsure of what to make of the scene. Meanwhile, Mom held my dad's hand and kept him calm until the ambulance showed up. I was hustled off to a neighbor's house while Mom rode to the hospital with my dad. By then, I decided that he was an idiot for ruining my party. I haven't changed my opinion much since, but about 2 a.m., Mom showed up and brought me home. I went to bed not knowing what had come of my dad and didn't really care. I remember I was mad at him. The next morning I came down to breakfast and Dad was sitting there all covered in bandages. I sat down and he proceeded to give me a speech about fire safety, and I fought to hide my grin. The irony was overwhelming, but I was able to hold myself together, nodding on occasion to feign interest. After breakfast, I retreated to my bedroom and had a good, long laugh. From then on, things returned to normal, but Dad never grilled again. My birthdays were orthodox affairs after that. A few friends would bring gifts, we'd have pizza, and then have some cake. The look on my dad's face every time I blew out the candles still makes me laugh. I don't believe their attempt at making more friends ever went anywhere. They befriended a few neighbors nearest to us, but from what I heard, the consensus was that my dad was a giant moron. My mom just happened to be fortunate enough to marry him. From experience, I'd say it's a pretty accurate assessment. This happened over 6 years ago, so I figured it would be okay to talk about now. Now, just to be safe, I'll use fake names in case anybody reads this. Not everybody likes their business being shared all over the internet, and I don't want nobody calling me a snitch. I hope that I made that clear enough. What I want to talk about happened in 2015. I was a senior in a small suburb outside of Chicago. On Friday at school, I was invited to a party. A guy was throwing it for his birthday, and I'd been in class with him when I was a freshman, and his cousin was my age. He'd been off at college until only recently. I didn't care why he was back. I was told there would be a keg and punch, and that's all I needed to hear. I got to the party after 10, and things were already well underway. I paid the guy at the door $5, and he handed me a cup. As long as I kept that cup, I could drink as much as I wanted, and I was eager to get that evening started. Another guy at the keg filled my cup, and I began looking around for someone I knew. Soon I ran into a guy from my chem class. We hung with each other for most of the night. There were a lot of girls around, but the only hot ones were with their boyfriends, obviously. One time, I thought that I may be about to hook up with a girl, but her friend showed up to block me at the last minute. The guy from chem had a girlfriend and wasn't interested in finding a girl. Instead, we just focused on drinking. When the keg was floated, I moved to the punch. It had so much liquor in it by then you couldn't taste any punch, and I was too drunk to care by then. Things began to slow down as the night dragged on. Most everyone was passed out or about to be, and I was on the verge of puking myself. About 2, this group of 3 guys showed up. Nobody seemed to recognize them. They walked around asking for Sean. I didn't know Sean personally, but I'd seen him around school. When they got to us, Chem Guy and I were outside getting fresh air, and neither of us had seen Sean for a long time and said so. They moved on across the yard until they happened to run into him. He was sitting on a lawn chair with some honey in his lap. Chem Guy and I were sitting under a tree fighting back the urge to puke when some yelling started. We looked over and saw the 3 strangers shouting at Sean about something, and Sean shouted back at them, and we heard 3 loud pops. The strangers ran off just after that. Everyone was asking what was up when the girl on Sean's lap started screaming. She got up and ran inside. I got up to get a closer look and saw Sean laid out in the chair, covered in blood, and he wasn't moving. Pretty soon, the news was spreading around the party. Anyone who could move took off, and I was among them. I said goodnight to Chem Guy and left just in time, as 2 police passed me less than a mile from the house. And I just passed out as soon as I got home, and it was a miracle that I didn't hurt myself or somebody else. The phone was full of messages when I woke up. Sean was dead. I can't say I was surprised. Several of our friends had also been arrested for drinking underage. Among them was Chem Guy, and all this made me happy that I gotten away when I did. That Monday, a bunch of people asked me if I'd seen what had happened. I didn't know who to trust, so I said no. I did talk briefly with Chem Guy, but he didn't want to discuss it, and that was probably for the best. And I never heard why it happened, and I didn't care. It wasn't any of my business. School was let out for the funeral, but I chose not to go. The cops did come to the school a few times looking for witnesses, but everyone was too afraid to say anything. The shooters will be caught later anyway, and are all serving life sentences somewhere. I haven't kept up with the case and have no interest in what has happened since. I left my hometown to get away from stuff like this. All of it is very clearly related to gangs, and it's best it stays in the past where it belongs. I do hope that Sean's family are doing okay, though. He seemed like a nice guy, and I think he had a little boy at the time, believe it or not. Life can be rough around there, and I'd imagine Sean would have wanted the best for his kid. I hope that he's able to get out when the time comes and achieve something. So many guys end up dead before they even get a chance around there. It is possible, though. If I did it, so can anyone else. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, you totally clam jammed me.